Hello and welcome to Red. Today I want to talk about Faust Part 2. Last week I made a video talking about Faust Part 1, and in that video, on top of talking about the first part of the tragedy, I also talk about my general impressions and the overall experience of reading. So I will skip out on that in this video and I will jump straight into talking about Faust Part 2. I'm going to need as much time as possible to talk about Faust Part 2 because as anyone who has read it will know, Part 2 is a substantially different, more crazy work than Faust Part 1 in many ways. And if I may confess, this is actually my third attempt at filming this video. Basically, both times I get 20-25 minutes into the video, throw up my hands and just realize I have no idea what this book is about, and I have no idea really how to say it or talk about it. So I'm just going to give it a go. It's going to be a kind of rambling review, and I might just have to kind of constantly refer back to the notes and the summaries of this section. But yeah, Faust Part 2 is considerably different and much more complex. Yes, it's steeped a lot more in allegory, but really the two differences that I think are fair to make is that the first one, as the translator John Williams mentions, is that the main difference between the first and the second one is that the second one really is a post-French Revolution work, and so Goethe is using a lot of the allegory in the work to talk about his opinions on the politics, the government, on capitalism, and on the church, etc. But then also the other thing is that Part 2, as Goethe said, really is for the mind. It is definitely an intellectual reading experience, whereas what we got from the prologue of the first one is him saying, I want to create a play that's going to be very enjoyable. And even though it is still intellectual in the first one, but it is definitely a substantial step up in terms of the amount of cognitive power that it takes to understand anything that's going on in Part 2. And it reminded me, I think Drake from the channel Orpheus, he talks about how his opinion is that Faust Part 2 is in a similar league of Finnegan's Wake in that it's really not actually understood fully by anybody. But anyway, let's give this a go. We're going to jump into Faust Part 2. I'm going to give some, insofar as I'm aware and so far as I even followed it, I'm going to try and give some summaries of what happens plot-wise, but really I will just be talking about certain language devices and things that stood out to me that I liked from the book. At the very end of Part 1, before I forget, there will be spoilers in this, and also if I happen to spoil any other books, I'll try and give some notice in advance. But jumping in just really quick, at the very end of Part 1, we have the ending is where Margarita gives up the ghost. Mephisto screams that she is condemned, but then a voice from above retorts that she's actually redeemed, and Mephisto and Faust basically need to get out of there. That's the end of Act 1. That's the end of Part 1, and then Act 1 of Part 2 starts with Faust basically just lying in a flower-strewn meadow. It's a very Arcadian scene, and we have a very different style of writing. So it's almost like, even though it is still written as a play and people are still speaking, it almost felt like the writing in Part 2 and all of Part 2 was a lot more poetic versus colloquial. And even though I can imagine that both of parts will be adapted and have been adapted for the stage, it feels like Part 1 is a lot more obvious that these are people talking and there are directions for them being on stage, whereas Part 2 just seems so I'll just read some examples. So we start off with Ariel, who's come to sort of hypnotize Faust, I suppose, to get him to get his shit together and to get back out there and be himself. And we also have a chorus of elves that are singing. But I'll read the last paragraph of Faust before we jump to the Imperial Palace, where Faust says this: Henceforth the sun shall always be behind me. With what delight I watch this torrent roaring along the rocky chasm, dashing blindly from crag to crag. It plunges, headlong pouring, and then into 1,000 streams diverges. High in the air, its spray in showers soaring. But with what splendour from this storm emerges the coloured rainbow's constant flux, now brightly painted, now with the misty shadows merges. A cooling haze around it gathers lightly. It shows us that our striving for perfection must fail. But then we pause and see more rightly our life is in that colourful reflection. Just completely different from part one, and I hope you can see the difference between that poetic voice versus the more like speakable or colloquial way of writing in the first one. We're jumping to the imperial palace. We've got the emperor, which I believe is the Holy Roman Emperor, and also some courtiers and an astrologer. We have a bit of an infiltration plot because and I'll see if I can get this right, but basically what happens is Faust and Mephistopheles come in. They want to help the Holy Roman Empire so that they can get some gain from him. In order to help him out, the emperor is just saying, there's a disruption in the land, we haven't got our stuff together, and Faust and Mephistopheles essentially say, you got plenty of natural resources, how about I introduce you to this concept of paper money? And the emperor's like, oh, what? But before he really starts to properly consider it, he says, we need to have a party. It's time we have a masquerade ball. And so we have a little bit of a cut to a spacious hall. If we remember back from part one, we had Walpurgis Night, where there is yes, we saw like characters and a lot of people, but then we saw some things like we saw the idealist, the realist, and so these concepts or these archetypes of people that were emerging. And we also got some surreal representations, like we saw the Will-o'-the-Wisp and the Shooting Star. In the masquerade scene, this just comes out like completely in full form, where so we start with the herald talking, and then the flower girls talking, but then the flowers themselves start talking. And we also have lines from the fruiting olive branch, the wreath of golden corn, the garland of flowers, a bouquet of flowers, and also rosebuds. And then what happens is, as more people get introduced to the masquerade, we get things like woodcutters and drunkards coming in. We have various poets coming in, but then when it starts to get really quite intense is when figures from Greek mythology come in. And Goethe specifically writes, the herald lets them have their way and meanwhile summons the figures of Greek mythology who, even in a modern guise, retain their character and charm. So we get introduced to the Graces, we get introduced to the Fates, we get introduced to the Furies, and then we start to have even more abstract concepts like fear and hope and prudence start speaking. We have the first example, I believe, maybe it's the first example of just a disguise in terms of the name. So we have a character, it kind of stands out as Zoilo Thersites, and that is actually just Mephistopheles, who is in disguise. And this comes up a little bit later, where later in the party a character named Plutus, who is the god of wealth, comes, and that is actually Faust incognito as well. And it's this kind of idea of yes, it's a masquerade ball, and so maybe we're meant to believe that they're real people who are just embodying or playing the part of mythological figures. But then when we get to Act 2, Act 3, we're very definitely meeting just the actual mythological figures and characters and concepts, and so it's it's a little bit, maybe this masquerade is sort of a transition period to get us used to that. But essentially what happens, the party gets pretty crazy, pretty raucous. We're reminded of course of the Master and Margarita's ball. One of the things that happens, especially when after the party is over, it's just Faust, the Emperor, Mephistopheles, they're talking, and the Emperor, his thing is that he wants to see Helen, and he wants to see Helen and Paris, the most beautiful couple. And so Faust is like, oh yeah, we can do that, no worries. And then later on, Faust is like, oh, hey, Mephisto, how do we do that? Like, I don't actually know how to do this. And so they're talking, Mephisto is saying, you know, like, I have an idea, I have a way of that we could do it. And Faust is like, tell me straight away. But Mephistopheles says, such secrets I'm reluctant to betray. Enthroned in solitude, remote, sublime, are deities beyond all space or time. Their name will make you quail when I reveal it. They are the mothers. And as William says in the notes, the scholarly consensus is divided on what the mothers are. We know that Goethe did invent them. I think we can make an argument that it relates to the very end of Act 5, specifically like the last couple of lines, right? But then Mephisto says later, describing the mothers, these goddesses exist beyond the range of mortals. Even we avoid their name. To find them, you must fathom the abyss. And if we need them now, you are to blame. And Faust is like, show me the way. So we're going to jump into the abyss. And essentially what it leads to is them going to Greece. You know, they're going to try and find they're going to go and try and find Helen. So we jump into Act 2. We have this, just at the very end of Act 1, Faust falls to the ground, and Mephisto kind of spirits him away and brings him back to Faust's former study. And we're kind of taking a look. We get introduced to some characters from early on. So we see the graduate, but most importantly, we see Wagner again, who is he's another teacher. And the important thing with Wagner is that he's invented the homunculus. Before we get to the homunculus, though, I just realized that it actually comes in, and Mephisto rolls his wheelchair closer to the front of the stage, addressing the pit, and says, he takes my breath away, I need more air, can some of you make room for me down there? So we get a very explicit fourth wall break, which is reminding me of Don Quixote, of course, with Part 2, and how it introduces that. But in the laboratory, we have Wagner at the kiln, and Mephistopheles moseys up to him and says, what's that? And Wagner says, it's a man being made, which, we're recalling that was used as the epigraph for the start of the recognitions, and it's the homunculus that gets made. And I really liked how the homunculus was introduced. So the homunculus is like existing in this little file. And the first thing he says is, well, Daddy dear, it was for real. I'm here. How are you? Give me a hug, but very lightly. The glass will shatter if you squeeze too tightly. That's how it is. The world's too small, I fear, for creatures of a natural kind. What's artificial needs to be confined. And then the really biting thing is that the homunculus turns to Mephistopheles and says, so you're here, cousin. And so there's a sort of relation like that. Later on, Mephisto is just criticizing the things that the homunculus is saying, and says, this is pure fantasy. You may be small, but all these tales you tell are pretty tall. I can't see anything. That's no surprise, replies the homunculus. You're from the north. You grew up in a pall of monkish gloom and chivalry. Your eyes are not accustomed to the light. You only feel at home in fog and night. We have a classical Walpurgis night. So instead of figures from Germanic and pagan myths, we have characters or like monsters from the from Greek mythology. We have the griffins, we have a sphinx arrive, we have ants of the colossal kind arrive, and a cool little just a line that kind of wigged me out, that the Sphinx says, Mephistopheles hears something and says, oh, something just whistled past my ear. The Sphinx says, those are the heads of the Lernaean snake chopped off by Hercules. You mustn't take them seriously. They think they still exist. This is one of those, again, another Don Quixote-esque, like maybe an author fixing something that happened in a previous work, where Faust is talking to Chiron. They're talking about Helen and about the experiences of what happened when she was abducted, and Faust says, and she was only 10 years old, and Chiron replies, I can see the scholars with their muddled speculation have quite confused you. In mythology, a woman is the poet's free creation, always youthful, aging never, keeping her enticing shape forever. Abducted young, still courted in her prime, the poet cannot be constrained by time. And I was like, oh, that's a pretty convenient thing to say from the guy who also, made Faust seduce Gretchen, who was only described as being older than 14, or at least 14 years old, but alright. The homunculus, wanting to become a person, ends up coming across some philosophers, and Mephistopheles is like, ugh, don't worry about them. But homunculus is really taken in, and specifically he's talking to Anaxagoras and Thales, who are some pre-Socratic philosophers. Eventually they lead the homunculus to realize, in a Darwinian sense, that the cycle of life begins in the ocean, so he breaks his vial, jumps in, goes, and is just goes through the cycle of life from the sea. I do like that there is a conflict, an explicit conflict between, the Greek influences and Mephisto, where Mephistopheles is trying to kind of be his general charismatic self, but then a dryad says, in your own land, your native wit might do, but foreign places seem to baffle you. So put away all thoughts of home, revere the grove of sacred oaks you've entered here. Okay, moving on, we've just started Act 3, and the most striking thing, and this is something that is really beautifully done in, just as a kind of poetic composition, but the thing that I think every reader will notice basically straight away is that we start Act 3, where before the palace of Menelaus in Sparta, and it's Helen. And the thing that we notice straight away is that Helen is not rhyming. So what she says, the first couple of lines are, so much admired, so much reviled, I, Helen, come from that same strand where only now we stepped ashore, still swaying with the unsteady rocking of the waves that bore us on their swelling crests from Phrygia's plains, by Eurus' strength and by Poseidon's grace, at last to safety in the shelter of our native bays. So no rhymes there. It's still very kind of beautiful writing, but specifically, Goethe is writing in a Greek iambic style, I believe, as was used by Homer. And there's a kind of really beautiful way in which Helen and Faust kind of learn to speak each other's language, because Faust comes in and essentially teaches her how to rhyme, and then there's this nice back and forth, but then it comes back in a somber or a tragic way, where after all of their experience is over, at the end of Act 3 and the start of Act 4, Faust actually has a little brief period where he's speaking still in the Greek style, even though he's lost Helen. So he's kind of mourning her through the way he's speaking. We have another very and this has been set up. This isn't even really disguised because this had been set up in Act 2, but Mephistopheles is incognito as the Phorcys, and he is, I think, like I mentioned, kind of serving as an anti or an ugly opposite of Helen. The first time rhyme resumes in Act 3 is from Lynceus the Watchman, who is coming as a sort of a traveler, a person traveling with Faust, and he just says, let me kneel and let me gaze, let me die or let me live, all my heart and soul I give to this God-sent lady's praise, blah 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 blah. And Helen goes through and is still just talking in her typical voice and in her style. However, after Helen says, don't worry about Palantheus or don't worry about Lynceus, she is surprised. She said, I see and hear so many wonders here. I am amazed. I wish to ask, but first explain to me why this man's speech had such a strange but friendly tone. One sound appeared companion to the other, and if one word is pleasing to the ear, another follows to caress the first. And so we go through, then they start to speak. Faust will start sentences, and then Helen will finish them in order for her to kind of pick up, and they begin to speak a common language. And it's just an overall, and I don't know how well or if this came through in the English translation, if it was even possible, but apparently Williams writes that there's even internal rhymes that it's just another layer of showing that connection. There's a scene a few years past, and Helen and Faust actually have had a child of Euphorion, and then there's just a kind of tragic idea of Euphorion being a bit too excited, wanting to go out and seeing the world, but then Euphorion falls into the abyss. Unfortunately, Helen is so sort of heartbroken that she also falls into the abyss, and Helen and Faust both say, Are we three doomed to be but a dream that fades again? And then they say, bliss must give way to pain, all joy has flown. And another thing that I noted is that later on we still have Phorkyias, but the way that Phorkyias had been speaking, like Phorkyias but Mephistopheles in disguise, I noted here that when Phorkyias says, now there's a lucky find for you, the vital flame is out, it's true, but never mind, there's plenty here to start, a guild of poets with its petty rifts and jealousies, all in the name of art. I can't endow them with poetic gifts, but with these clothes, at least they'll look the part. And that was, I felt like, just a very, very explicitly a Mephistopheles way of speaking, that before we could have, the guise was a little bit harder to see through. But now that everything's sort of breaking up, it kind of doesn't matter. And then at the very end, like the very end of Act 3, we just see an explicit Phorkyias steps down from the basin, removes her mask, and it's revealed that it's Mephistopheles, which we knew anyway. Like, that was explicitly said. Faust has a quick soliloquy talking where he's not rhyming, but then Mephistopheles comes in and starts talking to him, and Faust just slips back into the rhyming scheme. The Emperor and the Commander are saying, we need to kind of get everything under control, and so Faust comes in and summons these three archetypes of like these fighters to help him win the war, and we have and so he agrees, and as a way to Faust is doing it because he wants to get some more land, or get some untaxed land so that he can continue to study, and pretty much the Emperor is just saying, I feel like I'm signing, just in order to keep the kingdom, I'm signing everything away, and like all of Part 4 seems like a very like Goethe talking about maybe the process of the French Revolution or his political theories. We open Part 5 with Philemon and Baucis, who are figures from Greek mythology, and there's a very tragic interpretation of what happens with them. They end up getting their house burnt down, but another thing that I noted later, when we jump back to the palace, Faust is being sort of tormented by the sound of distant ringing bells, and here's a little bit of a spoiler for Satin Tango. That was a device that stood out to me. Like reading this made me remember that from Satin Tango. It starts with some distant bells ringing. Of course, there's so much in Satin Tango that is Faustian, but I also really, really liked, again, big spoiler for Satin Tango, but the very end where it seems like there's this warped, demented, homunculus type figure that's actually the thing that's ringing the bells. Faust is visited by some more concepts, namely want, debt, need, and care, and all of them cannot penetrate, but care eventually comes in and is trying to sort of like have one last appeal to reason, or try to just make Faust see what's happened, and he is very angry, but eventually she breathes on him and he is blinded. Mephistopheles sees what's going on and is like, I'm basically about to get Faust, and so I'm going to set it up to start digging his grave. And then in the end, after Faust sinks and falls and dies, Mephistopheles is talking to the chorus, and the chorus says, it's all over. Mephistopheles replies, over? A stupid word. Why over? The expression is absurd. What's over is just nothing. It's all one. Why else are we eternally employed to drag what has been made into the void? All's over. What is that supposed to mean? Over? It might as well have never been, but still it runs round as if it were. Eternal emptiness I'd much prefer. Setting up, Mephistopheles is like, he reckons that there's going to be some, Faust's body is not going to be very easy to obtain, and he's correct, because the heavenly host appears, and this is another one of those lines I talked about in my first one, in the first part, of just like goofy lines, but the fearsome jaws of hell open left. It's just so funny, but yeah, eventually what happens is the chorus of angels come and they find a way of distracting Mephistopheles, of actually distracting him so that they're able to take Faust and spirit him away. And so Mephistopheles ends up actually not claiming the soul of Faust, which is really weird because it's still considered a tragedy in light of the fact that here at the end in the mountain gorges, we go through and we realize that the being or the spirit that actually saved Faust was Gretchen, was Margarita, and it ends up with this chorus mysticus chanting, "All that is mutable is but reflected. What is inscrutable here is affected. What is not understood here it is done. Eternal womanhood draws us all on," and then finished. And yeah, that's part 2 of Faust, and I've still got no idea what happened, but I loved it and it was great to read. So thank you for watching. If you have any idea what happened in Faust Part 2, I'd really love to know. Again, I'm keen to go back and reread it. If you have any good analyses and stuff, or any good essays that anybody's written on Faust Part 2, I'd love to read them and let me know. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all in the next video.